My name is Tessa. I am 33 years old, and I spent my entire life trying to earn a place at a table where the seats were intentionally pulled away from me. My family has always treated me like a poorly kept secret, a stain on their pristine reputation that they could never quite wash out. Last Saturday night, under the glittering crystal chandeliers of the Oakridge Country Club in suburban Connecticut, my family hosted a dinner for my 33rd birthday. It sounded like a kind gesture to anyone looking from the outside. But inside that dining room, surrounded by wealthy patrons and judging eyes, my younger sister slid a brightly wrapped box across the white tablecloth. I pulled back the expensive wrapping paper to find a commercial DNA test kit. Before I could even process the image on the box, my sister laughed loudly, ensuring that every neighboring table could hear her perfectly. She leaned forward, pointing at the box, and said, "Maybe this will finally explain why you are another man's mistake of the family, because you certainly do not have the Kensington business genes." Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to endure the cruelty of a family who treated your very existence as an inconvenience. Growing up in Connecticut meant that appearances were the only currency that truly mattered. Our family estate was a sprawling mansion with perfectly manicured gardens and a private tennis court. It was the kind of home that commanded respect from the neighbors and awe from passers-by. But behind those heavy oak doors, the atmosphere was suffocatingly cold. My mother Beatrice married my stepfather, Harrison Kensington, when I was just a toddler. Harrison was the heir to the Kensington luxury retail empire, a man whose entire identity was built on old money and social dominance. Together they created a world where perfection was demanded and affection was strictly conditional. 2 years after their wedding, my sister Bianca was born. From the exact moment she took her first breath, the dynamic in our household was permanently sealed. Bianca was the golden child, the true Kensington heir, the perfect blend of my mother's social ambition and Harrison's arrogant pride. I was simply the leftovers from my mother's first marriage to a man she claimed had died penniless and worthless. The birthday dinner had been tense long before the dessert plates were cleared. We were seated at the absolute center of the main dining room, a strategic choice by my mother, who always needed to be seen by the right people. Harrison sat at the head of the table swirling his expensive bourbon and speaking loudly about his recent golf handicap. Bianca sat directly across from me, wearing a designer dress that cost more than my first car. She spent the first hour of the evening holding court, dominating every conversation with tales of her lavish vacations and her upcoming social events. Whenever I tried to speak, whether to answer a polite question from the waiter or to offer a comment on the food, Bianca would loudly interrupt me. My mother and Harrison simply allowed it, turning their attention to Bianca, as if my voice lacked the proper frequency for them to hear. I sat there in my modest but elegant tailored suit, pushing roasted vegetables around my porcelain plate. I had learned long ago that surviving family gatherings meant making myself as small and quiet as possible. Every interaction at that table was a calculated reminder of my place in their hierarchy. When the waiter came to take our drink orders, Harrison selected a vintage wine for the table, but specifically told the waiter to bring me the house water, joking that my palate had never quite developed past my biological father's cheap tastes. My mother offered a small, tight smile at the remark, adjusting her diamond necklace while looking at me with thinly veiled disappointment. They delighted in these subtle humiliations. For decades, they had painted a picture of me as the struggling, incompetent daughter who needed their constant charity just to survive. They told their wealthy friends that I was going through a prolonged phase of finding myself. They never missed an opportunity to remind me that I was an outsider who should be infinitely grateful that Harrison had agreed to keep a roof over my head. I had spent my entire youth trying to prove them wrong. I earned top grades, won academic scholarships, and worked late shifts at local diners just to buy my own school supplies. But no amount of hard work could rewrite the narrative they had constructed. To them, I was eternally the mistake. The moment of the grand humiliation arrived just as the waiters brought out the dessert course. The dining room was buzzing with the low hum of conversation from the surrounding tables. Bianca tapped her manicured nails against the edge of the table, a smug expression settling over her perfectly contoured face. She reached down into her designer handbag and pulled out a small rectangular box wrapped in silver paper with a large silk bow. She slid it across the smooth surface of the table until it stopped directly in front of my coffee cup. Her voice was uncharacteristically sweet when she told me to open it, a fake sweetness that immediately set off warning bells in my mind. I looked at the box, then at my mother, who simply took a delicate sip of her wine and watched me with cool detachment. Harrison leaned back in his chair, crossing his arms over his chest, waiting for the show. My hands were steady as I reached for the silk bow. I untied the ribbon and carefully peeled back the silver paper. I lifted the lid of the box, expecting perhaps a passive-aggressive self-help book or a cheap piece of costume jewelry. Instead, staring back at me was the bright, clinical packaging of a commercial genetic testing kit. I stared at the cardboard tube, my mind taking a fraction of a second to register the cruelty of the gesture. Before I could even lift my eyes from the box, Bianca projected her voice across the room. She spoke with deliberate volume, ensuring that the affluent couples at the neighboring tables paused their meals to listen. "Maybe this will finally explain why you are another man's mistake of the family," she laughed. The sound was sharp and grating, slicing through the polite ambiance of the country club. "You certainly do not have the Kensington business genes, so we might as well find out exactly what kind of mediocre blood is running through your veins." The silence that fell over our immediate section of the dining room was heavy and suffocating. A few people at the next table turned their heads, their faces a mixture of shock and morbid curiosity. I felt a hot flush of heat rise in my chest, a physiological reaction to being publicly stripped of my dignity. I looked directly at Bianca, watching her revel in her own cruelty. She looked triumphant, completely satisfied with her ability to reduce me to a punchline in front of Connecticut's elite. I turned my gaze to my parents, waiting for the defense that a normal mother or father would instinctively provide. I waited for my mother to scold Bianca for causing a scene, or for Harrison to demand respect at his dinner table. Instead, my mother slowly placed her crystal wine glass down on the coaster. She did not look angry at Bianca. She looked annoyed with me. "Bianca, do not be tacky," my mother sighed, waving her hand dismissively in the air. "Even if it is true, there is no need to be so loud about it." She then turned her cold, calculating eyes onto me. "Tessa, put that ridiculous box away. It is bad enough that Harrison had to subsidize your little startup phase in your 20s while you aimlessly figured out your life. We do not need to advertise our family burdens to the entire country club." Harrison chuckled softly, nodding in agreement as he signaled the waiter for the check. I looked down at the DNA kit, feeling the heavy weight of their judgment pressing against my shoulders. Their words were meant to be the final nail in the coffin of my self-esteem. They wanted me to lower my head, apologize for my existence, and quietly accept my role as the eternal scapegoat. They genuinely believed that I was still the frightened, dependent girl they had bullied for 33 years. They thought my silence was submission. They had absolutely no idea that my silence was actually a carefully calculated strategy. I did not give them the satisfaction of a single tear. I did not raise my voice, and I did not utter a word to defend the memory of my biological father. I simply looked down at the brightly colored cardboard box sitting next to my coffee cup. The dining room around us was still holding its collective breath, waiting for the inevitable breakdown that my family so desperately wanted to witness. Bianca leaned forward, a victorious smirk plastered across her contoured face, fully expecting me to flee the table in shame, just like I had done when we were teenagers. Instead, I reached out with a perfectly steady hand. I picked up the small plastic swab from the table, placed it meticulously back into its plastic casing, and closed the lid of the box. I smoothed out the silver wrapping paper, folded it neatly, and tucked the entire package into my leather handbag. The sheer normalcy of my movements seemed to confuse them. My mother furrowed her brow, her posture stiffening slightly, as she realized I was not playing my assigned role in her theater of cruelty. Harrison uncrossed his arms, leaning forward with a sudden look of deep suspicion. They had backed me into a corner, but I was not cowering under their pressure. I calmly unclasped the brass hardware of my purse and reached into the hidden side pocket. My fingers brushed against the heavy, cool metal of the card I kept buried there for specific moments like this one. It was a matte black centurion card forged from anodized titanium. It was the kind of card that was issued strictly by invitation, only given exclusively to individuals whose liquid net worth exceeded the wildest dreams of the upper middle class patrons sitting around us. It was an unspoken symbol of absolute financial dominance, and it was a card that Harrison had spent the last decade trying to qualify for and failing miserably every time. I pulled it out and set it face down on the pristine white tablecloth. The dull thud of the heavy metal hitting the table sounded incredibly loud in the quiet, suffocating tension of our dining section. I raised my hand and signaled for our waiter. He hurried over immediately, his face flushed with the awkwardness of having witnessed my sister's cruel outburst moments prior. He stood at attention next to Harrison, instinctively assuming the wealthy patriarch of the table would be handling the extravagant check for the birthday dinner. Harrison reached into his small suit jacket, offering a patronizing smile to the young man as he prepared to pay for the evening. He cleared his throat, ready to make a grand public show of his reluctant charity toward his disappointing stepdaughter. I slid the heavy black card across the table, pushing it directly past Harrison's outstretched hand until it stopped precisely in front of the waiter. "Put the entire family tab on this," I said, my voice clear, calm, and level. "Make sure you include Bianca's third bottle of Dom Perignon, along with the vintage wine my stepfather ordered for himself." The waiter looked down at the table, his eyes widening dramatically as he recognized the distinctive black metal resting against the white linen. He picked it up with a sudden deep reverence, completely ignoring Harrison's frozen posture. I looked directly into my sister's wide eyes and offered her a genuine, relaxed smile that carried absolutely no warmth. "Consider it a thank you for the clarity, Bianca." The reaction across the table was instantaneous and profoundly satisfying to witness. Bianca's jaw literally dropped, the smug superiority draining from her face in a matter of seconds. Her mocking laughter died in her throat, replaced by a look of utter bewilderment. My mother stared at the empty space on the table where the card had just been, her carefully maintained social composure shattering completely. She blinked rapidly, her mind struggling to reconcile the image of the struggling, dependent daughter she loved to pity with the woman who casually dropped a payment method that required tens of millions in liquid assets just to possess. Harrison looked as though the air had been knocked out of his lungs. His hand was still hovering awkwardly over the table, his own platinum card feeling inadequate and common by comparison. His face turned a deep shade of crimson as the reality of the situation washed over him. Nobody spoke a single word. The heavy silence that had originally been meant to humiliate me was now suffocating them in their own chairs. The waiter returned mere moments later carrying a silver tray. He bypassed Harrison entirely and approached my side of the table, offering me the printed receipt and a sleek black pen with a respectful nod. He did not ask for identification, nor did he question the staggering total of the bill that included several bottles of premium champagne. The transaction had cleared instantly, smoothly, without a single hitch. I calmly took the pen and signed my name with a fluid motion. I added a generous 40% tip for his trouble, knowing he had endured an uncomfortable atmosphere, and tucked the heavy titanium card safely back into my purse. I stood up, smoothing the wrinkles from my tailored skirt, and looked down at the three of them. They were sitting frozen in their dining chairs, completely trapped in their own shock. I did not say a word to them. I did not offer any explanations, and I did not wish them a good night. I simply turned on my heel and walked out of the dining room. I kept my head high and my shoulders pulled back, moving with the quiet grace of someone who knew exactly who they were and exactly what they were worth. The crisp autumn air felt refreshing as I stepped out of the glass doors of the country club and handed my ticket to the valet. When my sleek car arrived, I slid into the driver's seat and closed the heavy door, shutting out the toxic world I had just left behind. I started the engine, but I did not pull away from the curb immediately. I reached into my handbag and pulled out the colored DNA kit, tossing it onto the passenger seat next to me. The glow of the streetlights illuminated the bold lettering on the side of the box. Bianca thought she had given me a cruel weapon designed to destroy my own self-esteem. She genuinely thought she was proving that I was an outsider, a genetic mistake with absolutely no claim to the mighty Kensington family legacy or their supposed business brilliance. I looked at the small box resting on the seat and let out a soft, genuine laugh that echoed in the quiet interior of my car. I was absolutely going to take that genetic test as soon as I got home. I was not going to take it to find some lost imaginary family or to discover where I truly belonged in the world. I already knew exactly where I belonged. I was going to take it to trigger a dormant legal trap that had been waiting patiently in the dark. I had spent years meticulously building my immense wealth in absolute secrecy, waiting for my 33rd birthday to arrive. This little plastic swab was the final key I needed to unlock a massive financial reckoning that would rip the ground out from under them. The drive back to my downtown apartment was quiet and remarkably peaceful. I parked in my secured underground garage and took the private elevator up to my floor. Once inside the familiar comfort of my home, I did not waste a single second. I walked straight to my kitchen counter, tore open the brightly colored cardboard box, and pulled out the sterile plastic swab. I followed the provided instructions, meticulously swabbing the inside of my cheek for the required amount of time before sealing the sample into the protective vial. I registered the unique barcode online using a secure server and placed the prepaid shipping envelope by my front door. I dropped it off at the post office the very next morning before the sun even had a chance to fully rise over the city skyline. Then the waiting period officially began. For an entire week, the Kensington family maintained a heavy, suffocating silence. My phone did not ring with angry demands from my mother. Harrison did not send his usual passive-aggressive emails inquiring about my financial stability. Bianca was completely absent from her usual social media posting sprees. The silence was not a sign of surrender. It was the quiet retreat of predators regrouping after a humiliating defeat. They were licking their wounds and plotting a way to put me back in my designated place as the family failure. They needed to restore the natural order of their universe, an order where they held absolute power, and I was entirely dependent on their manufactured grace. I knew they would strike back, but I also knew they were armed with outdated information about who I was and what I possessed. Exactly 7 days after the birthday dinner, my phone vibrated with an incoming email notification. I was sitting in my home office sipping black coffee when I saw the subject line from the genetic testing company. The results were finally ready. I clicked the secure link and logged into the online portal. The screen immediately populated with colorful pie charts and geographical data, but I scrolled straight past the ancestral history. I was only looking for one specific confirmation. There it was, clear and undeniable, verifying my biological connection to a man my mother had spent 3 decades trying to erase from existence. But the real magic happened 30 minutes later. My personal lawyer, a brilliant man who managed my private holdings, called me on my encrypted line. The confirmation of my DNA had automatically triggered an alert in a sealed legal registry in the state capital. My biological father was never the worthless loser my mother claimed him to be. He had been a deeply private real estate tycoon who preferred to operate in the shadows, quietly acquiring massive parcels of commercial land, while the Kensington family loudly boasted about their retail empire. Before he passed away, he had locked his entire holding company into an ironclad generational trust. The stipulations were incredibly specific. The trust and all its vast assets would fully transfer to his only biological child on her 33rd birthday, provided her identity was genetically confirmed and legally recorded. Bianca thought she was giving me a gag gift to mock my heritage. Instead, her petty joke was the exact biological proof required by the state registry to vest me with absolute control over a multi-billion-dollar real estate empire. The legal transfer was initiated the moment my lawyer submitted the genetic certificate to the probate court. I was now the sole owner of everything my father had built. While my lawyer finalized the quiet transfer of the holding company, my family was busy orchestrating what they believed would be my ultimate downfall. Harrison had spent the last 20 years managing the Kensington family luxury retail empire. It was a sprawling network of high-end boutiques and commercial properties that projected an image of invincible old money. Harrison loved to remind everyone that he was a titan of industry. He used his corporate power to control the family, handing out jobs and apartments to relatives, as long as they remained blindly loyal to him. For the past 5 years, I had maintained the illusion of living in a modest mid-range apartment building located in the downtown district. It was a building that happened to be managed by a subsidiary of the Kensington real estate division. I paid my rent on time every month, playing the role of the struggling independent woman who still relied on her stepfather's corporate network for a roof over her head. Harrison and Bianca saw this as their perfect weapon. They could not force me to unblock the black credit card or explain my sudden wealth, but they could attack my living situation to remind me who was truly in charge. They wanted to strip away my security and force me to come crawling back to the family estate, begging for forgiveness and a place to sleep. The retaliation arrived on a Tuesday afternoon in the form of a cold, impersonal digital notification. I was sitting at my desk, quietly reviewing the newly acquired asset portfolios from my father's vast trust, when my personal email chimed loudly. It was a formal eviction notice sent directly from the Kensington Property Management Division. The rigid document stated that my month-to-month lease was being terminated immediately due to sudden internal corporate restructuring. I was given exactly 30 days to vacate the premises and surrender my keys. The language was sterile and deeply insulting, crafted specifically by Harrison's legal team to make me feel small, isolated, and powerless. Before I could even finish reading the attached legal jargon detailing the eviction process, my cell phone lit up with a text message from Bianca. She could never resist the urge to gloat when she thought she had won a battle. Her message was short, brutal, and dripping with venom. Dad's company owns your building. You have 30 days to pack your cheap furniture. Actions have consequences. I stared at the text message, the bright light of the screen reflecting in my eyes. I could easily picture her sitting in the country club, laughing with my mother as she hit send. She wanted me to panic. She fully expected me to call her in tears, pleading for more time, or begging for a chance to speak with Harrison to resolve the misunderstanding. They desperately wanted to watch me break under the pressure. I set my phone down gently on the glass surface of my desk and smiled. It was a slow, deliberate smile that reached my eyes, filling me with a profound sense of anticipation and absolute calm. Harrison and Bianca were happily operating under the arrogant delusion that they were the landlords of my entire life. They had absolutely no idea that my own private venture capital firm had spent the last 2 years systematically buying up the premium downtown real estate market through a network of anonymous limited liability companies. They thought they were evicting a helpless, dependent tenant who had stepped out of line. They did not know they had just confidently declared war on the very person who now held the deed to their entire corporate existence. The trap had been set, and they had just eagerly walked right into it. I picked up my phone and composed a professional reply to Bianca, agreeing to meet them in the lobby at 4 o'clock. I did not include apologies or pleas for mercy, which would only infuriate them further. I spent the hour preparing for the confrontation. I refused to look like the struggling tenant they expected. I selected a sharply tailored charcoal gray suit, a crisp silk blouse, and leather heels. Gathering the notarized legal documents from my safe, I slid them into a portfolio. Stepping into the elevator, I felt a steady rhythm in my chest. The lobby was an expansive, modern space featuring polished marble floors, towering glass windows, and a massive geometric chandelier casting a warm glow. I took a seat on a plush leather sofa near the concierge desk, resting my portfolio on my lap. I only waited 10 minutes before the heavy revolving doors spun open. Harrison walked in first, wearing a custom pinstripe suit and an expression of supreme arrogance. He carried himself like a feudal lord inspecting his conquered territory. Bianca trailed close behind him, holding a designer coffee cup and recording the lobby on her smartphone, hoping to capture my breakdown for her group chats. What truly set the tone was the presence of the building's head of security, a heavily built man named Hank, whom Harrison summoned to act as muscle. Hank looked uncomfortable, his eyes darting around as Harrison barked quiet orders. They treated a standard lease termination like a military extraction. Harrison spotted me sitting calmly, and his smug smile widened. He gestured for Hank and Bianca to follow as he marched directly toward my seating area. He did not bother to sit down. He stood towering over me, intentionally using his physical height and the security guard to create an atmosphere of intimidation. "You have a lot of nerve showing your face downstairs after the stunt you pulled at the country club." Harrison began, his voice booming across the lobby. The concierge discreetly looked away. Bianca let out a mocking laugh, aiming her phone camera directly at my face. "I told you actions have consequences, Tessa," she sneered. "You thought you could embarrass us in front of society with some flashy credit card you maxed out. Now look at you. You are about to be homeless." Harrison held up a hand, silencing his daughter to deliver his grand ultimatum. "I am a reasonable man, Tessa," he said, his tone dripping with false magnanimity. "If you are willing to draft a formal apology to your mother and sister, and if you reimburse me for the financial cost of the dinner, I might speak with the property management division. I could grant you a 60-day extension to pack your cheap furniture and find a suitable living arrangement in a less desirable neighborhood." He crossed his arms, waiting for me to crumble, waiting for me to beg for the roof over my head. I slowly stood up from the leather sofa, making sure I was standing at my full height. I looked at Harrison, then at Bianca, and finally at Hank, the security guard, who shifted his weight awkwardly. I did not raise my voice, and I did not show a single ounce of fear. "Harrison," I said evenly, "the problem with assuming you hold all the power is that you stop paying attention to who actually signs the checks." I unzipped my leather portfolio and pulled out the thick stack of premium watermarked legal documents. I held them out to my stepfather. He looked at the papers, his brow furrowing in confusion, but his massive ego compelled him to snatch them from my hand. He adjusted his suit jacket and began to read the top page. I watched his eyes scan the dense legal jargon, waiting for the exact moment the reality of his situation breached his fortress of arrogance. It took him exactly 10 seconds to read the pertinent details. The color drained completely from Harrison's face, leaving his skin a sickly gray. His hands, which had been so steady and commanding just moments prior, began to tremble visibly, causing the thick pages to rustle in the quiet lobby. "What is this?" he whispered, his voice suddenly stripped of all its booming authority. Bianca lowered her phone, her smug expression faltering as she noticed the sudden terror radiating from her father. "Dad, what does it say?" she asked, trying to peer over his broad shoulder. I did not wait for him to find his voice to explain it to her. "I am sure you are very familiar with the property management subsidiary that handles this building, Harrison," I said, taking a slow, deliberate step forward to close the distance between us. "What you clearly failed to realize is that the subsidiary sold this entire high-rise property 2 years ago. The buyer was an anonymous holding company, a limited liability corporation, designed specifically to acquire premium downtown real estate without attracting media attention." Harrison swallowed hard, his eyes glued to the signature lines on the final page of the master deed. "The holding company is fully owned and operated by my venture capital firm." I continued, my voice echoing slightly off the marble walls. "I am the sole managing partner. I am the anonymous buyer. I bought this building, the ground beneath it, and the property management company that currently issues your corporate paychecks. I am not your tenant, Harrison. I am your ultimate boss." Bianca let out a shrill gasp, her eyes darting between my calm face and the legal documents trembling in her father's hands. "That is impossible," she stammered, taking a step back. "You do not have that kind of money. You are just trying to scare us with fake papers." Harrison knew they were not fake. He had spent his life dealing with corporate acquisitions and commercial real estate deeds. He recognized the official state seals, the watermarks, and the binding signatures of the corporate attorneys. He knew with absolute certainty that he was holding the legal proof of his own monumental miscalculation. In a desperate attempt to regain control of a situation that had completely slipped through his fingers, Harrison turned to the head of security. "Hank," he barked, his voice cracking with a mixture of fear and absolute rage. "Remove this woman from the lobby immediately. She is causing a disturbance and harassing the management. Escort her off the premises right now." Hank stood completely still. The burly security guard looked at Harrison, then looked down at the documents and finally looked respectfully at me. He had been briefed by the property management director earlier that morning about the true identity of the building owner, a standard protocol whenever the managing partner was expected to be involved in a localized dispute. Hank took a very deliberate, highly visible step backward, physically distancing himself from Harrison and Bianca. "I am sorry, Sir Hank," said, his voice deep and entirely unapologetic. "I cannot do that. Miss Tessa is the primary owner of this property. She signs my paychecks. If anyone is going to be escorted off the premises today, it is going to be you." Harrison stared at the security guard, his mouth opening and closing without producing a single sound. The power dynamic in the room had flipped so violently and completely that he was experiencing a kind of emotional whiplash. Bianca dropped her phone back into her designer handbag, her face flushed with a deep, consuming humiliation. They had marched into my lobby expecting to crush a helpless victim. Instead, they found themselves standing in a fortress that I exclusively owned, completely outgunned and entirely at my mercy. I reached out and gently plucked the stack of legal documents right out of Harrison's trembling hands. I slid them neatly back into my leather portfolio and zipped it closed. I did not even look at Bianca as she stood frozen next to her father. The lobby was now completely under my command. Harrison was staring at his empty hands, his chest rising and falling in shallow, erratic breaths. He was a man who had built his entire identity on the illusion of absolute control, and I had just shattered that illusion in less than 5 minutes. He tried to straighten his posture, desperately attempting to piece his shattered dignity back together. He smoothed the lapels of his custom pinstripe suit, though his hands were still visibly shaking. "You think you are so clever, Tessa," he finally managed to say, his voice lacking its usual booming resonance. "You think buying one residential building gives you the right to disrespect this family. This changes nothing. You are still an outsider playing dress-up with whatever scraps of money you manage to hustle together. My retail empire generates hundreds of millions of dollars. You are a minor annoyance, nothing more." I smiled at him. I had anticipated this exact reaction. Harrison was entirely predictable. When cornered, he would always retreat behind the massive shield of the Kensington luxury retail empire. He genuinely believed that his corporate dynasty made him untouchable. He was a man completely blinded by his own privilege. "I am so glad you brought up the retail empire, Harrison," I said, keeping my tone perfectly conversational. I reached back into my leather portfolio and pulled out a separate, thick manila envelope. I had prepared this specific document over a week ago precisely for this moment. I held the envelope out toward him. "Take it, Dad," Bianca whispered, her voice trembling with fear. "Just take it and let us get out of here." Harrison snatched the envelope from my hand. He ripped open the top and pulled out the crisp legal pages. Unlike the property deed he had just read, this document was heavily stamped with the bright red seals of commercial debt collectors. It was a formal legal notice of default. I watched his eyes dart across the page, tracing the familiar addresses of his most prized retail locations. These were the flagship stores that anchored the entire Kensington brand across the city, projecting an image of endless wealth. I decided to narrate the contents of the document for Bianca's benefit. As I am sure you are aware, Harrison, the retail sector, has experienced a slight downturn over the last few quarters. I began pacing slowly. But what the public does not know is that the Kensington Empire is secretly drowning in commercial debt. You have been quietly defaulting on your corporate leases for the past 8 months. Harrison's eyes widened in sheer terror. Bianca gasped aloud, stepping away from her father, as if his sudden financial ruin were contagious. You see, I continued, my voice steady. The real estate developers who originally leased you those prime retail locations grew very tired of your continuous excuses and missed payments. They were looking to offload your toxic debt. So my holding company stepped in. We bought your commercial leases for pennies on the dollar. We acquired the debt for every single one of your flagship stores across the entire metropolitan area. That is a lie, Bianca blurted out. We are rich. Our stores make millions. Your stores bleed money, Bianca. I corrected her gently. Your father has been shifting funds from your personal trusts just to cover payroll, and he still cannot afford the rent. I turned my attention back to Harrison, who was now sweating profusely. The expensive cologne he wore could not mask the sudden scent of genuine panic. You are not just a bad businessman, Harrison. You are a fraud. And because my holding company now legally owns your commercial leases, that makes me your landlord on every single property that matters to your dying empire. That formal notice details exactly how much you currently owe me in back rent penalties and late fees. The total is staggering. Harrison swallowed hard, the muscles in his neck straining. Tessa, please. He rasped, his voice dropping to a desperate whisper. You cannot do this. If you call in this debt, the company will collapse. We will be forced into bankruptcy. The media will find out. It will destroy our reputation. I looked at him, feeling absolutely no pity. I am initiating collection protocols tomorrow. I stated, the finality of my words ringing clearly through the marble lobby. You have until the end of the business day tomorrow to wire the full balance of your defaulted rent into my corporate account. If the funds do not clear, my legal team will file the eviction notices with the city court, and we will physically lock the doors of every Kensington retail store before the morning rush. Harrison went completely pale. The last remaining drops of blood seemed to vanish from his face, leaving him looking hollow and aged. He finally understood that he was entirely at my mercy. His entire legacy was hanging by a thread that I held between my fingers. Let us go, Harrison muttered. He turned around, walking toward the revolving doors with a slow, defeated shuffle. Bianca hurried after him, her designer heels clicking frantically. There was nothing left to boast about. I stood in the lobby and watched them leave, feeling a profound sense of peace. I had simply presented them with the cold, hard reality of their own failures. I picked up my portfolio and took the elevator back up to my apartment. The battle was won, but the war was far from over. I knew they would try to manipulate me with toxic family guilt. I did not have to wait long. Less than 3 hours later, my personal cell phone rang. I looked at the caller identification and saw my mother's name flashing brightly on the screen. Beatrice had been noticeably absent from the lobby confrontation. Harrison must have rushed straight home to deliver the devastating news. I let the phone ring 4 times before I finally accepted the call. I simply waited for her to speak. Tessa, my mother's voice came through the speaker, breathless and laced with an underlying current of absolute panic. We need to see you. I am quite busy, Beatrice, I replied. I have several collection protocols to finalize before the morning. Please, Tessa. Her voice cracked slightly, a rare display of genuine emotion from a woman who usually operated like a machine. Harrison explained everything. We had no idea the situation was this severe. We need to sit down and discuss this like rational adults. We need to find a compromise. I remained silent, letting her stew in her own anxiety. I am scheduling a mandatory family meeting, she continued, her voice growing slightly more desperate. Tomorrow morning, 10 o'clock sharp, at the estate. Please, Tessa, you owe us at least a conversation before you destroy everything we have built. I owe you absolutely nothing, I said quietly. Just come to the house, she pleaded. We are your family, we raised you, we need to handle this together. I considered her desperate request. Refusing to go would be easy, but it would not give me the complete resolution I was looking for. I needed them to put all their cards on the table. I needed to see exactly how low they were willing to sink. Fine, I said, my voice carrying no warmth. I will be at the estate tomorrow morning at 10 o'clock. But do not mistake my attendance for a negotiation. I am only coming to hear what you have to say. Thank you. She breathed out, a heavy sigh of relief escaping her lips. We will see you tomorrow. I ended the call and placed the phone face down on my kitchen counter. Beatrice genuinely believed that she could summon me to the ancestral estate and use the oppressive history of that mansion to intimidate me into submission. She genuinely thought she could play the family loyalty card to save her husband's failing business. She had no idea that walking into that mansion was exactly what I wanted. I walked over to my home office and slowly prepared the next set of legal documents. The morning sun was casting long, dramatic shadows across the sprawling front lawn of the Kensington estate when I pulled my car up to the wrought iron gates. The security guard recognized me and buzzed me through without a word. I drove slowly up the winding tree-lined driveway, taking a moment to truly look at the property. The mansion was a colossal stone structure that looked more like a European fortress than a family home. It was designed to make anyone approaching it feel incredibly small and insignificant. For my entire childhood, that design had worked perfectly on me. I used to walk up these stone steps with my head down, constantly terrified of making a mistake, terrified of breathing too loudly and disturbing the fragile peace. Today, however, my footsteps were steady and heavy against the imported stone. I was carrying the leather portfolio containing the formal notices of default, but I had also brought something entirely new. I pressed the heavy brass doorbell and waited. The massive wooden door was opened by the housekeeper, who offered me a tight, nervous smile and directed me toward the formal dining room. The house was painfully quiet, lacking the usual bustling energy of caterers or decorators preparing for my mother's endless stream of social events. The silence was the sound of a financial empire holding its breath. I stepped into the dining room. The space was dominated by an enormous antique mahogany table that could comfortably seat 20 guests. My mother and Harrison were seated at the far end, positioned strategically to force me to walk the entire length of the room to reach them. It was a classic corporate intimidation tactic, a psychological play meant to establish dominance before a single word was spoken. I did not rush. I walked at a leisurely, relaxed pace, pulling out a chair at the opposite end of the long table and sitting down. I placed my leather portfolio on the polished wood surface. Beatrice was wearing a tailored cashmere sweater, set her hair perfectly styled, projecting the image of a calm, collected matriarch. Harrison sat stiffly beside her, looking noticeably worse than he had in the lobby the day before. The deep circles under his eyes suggested he had not slept a single minute. Bianca was nowhere to be seen, likely banished upstairs so the adults could handle the crisis she had so happily ignited at the country club. I folded my hands on the table and looked directly at them, waiting for the performance to begin. Tessa. My mother began, her voice dripping with an artificial honeyed sweetness that immediately set my teeth on edge. Thank you for coming home. We know things became a little heated yesterday and we want to apologize for the misunderstanding in your lobby. Harrison was just surprised, that is all. We are actually quite impressed with how well you have done for yourself in the business world. It shows that the Kensington work ethic rubbed off on you after all. I did not return her smile. I simply stared at her, letting the ridiculous statement hang in the air. She was actually trying to take credit for the wealth I had built completely independently, attributing my success to simply breathing the same air as her husband. My mother cleared her throat, her fake smile faltering just a fraction of an inch before she pushed forward. We asked you here today because we need to remember what truly matters. Money comes and goes, Tessa, but family is forever. Blood is thicker than water. We have always provided for you. We gave you a beautiful home, an excellent education, and a name that carries weight in this city. Now the family business has hit a temporary rough patch. The retail market has been brutal lately. We need you to step up and act like a true Kensington. We need you to cancel the collection protocols and forgive the commercial leases your company acquired. We need to keep this in the family. It is the only right thing to do. I listened to her desperate plea, amazed by the sheer audacity of her request. She was asking me to wipe away tens of millions of dollars in corporate debt simply because we shared biology, the very same biology they had mocked just over a week ago. Harrison leaned forward, attempting to look like a stern but fair father figure, but the desperation in his eyes completely ruined the effect. He was silently begging me to save him from absolute ruin. I leaned forward slightly, resting my forearms on the mahogany table. "Beatrice," I said, making sure my voice was completely devoid of emotion, "I am not a Kensington." Bianca made sure to loudly remind me of that fact in front of half the city. "I am the sole managing partner of a venture capital firm, and your husband is a severely delinquent tenant. I am not here to rescue a family legacy that never included me in the first place. I am here to collect a debt. I will not be dropping the collection protocols. If the funds are not wired by the end of the business day, the stores will be locked." The polite maternal facade shattered into a million pieces. The sudden transformation was violent and immediate. Beatrice slammed both of her hands flat against the table, her manicured nails digging into the polished wood. She shot out of her chair, knocking it backward. Her face contorted with a sudden vicious rage that made the veins in her neck stand out prominently against her pale skin. The sweet, caring mother vanished entirely, replaced by the vicious, controlling woman I had known my entire life. Harrison did not try to calm her down. He sat there, his jaw clenched, fully supporting her verbal assault. "How dare you speak to me like that?" she screamed, her voice echoing sharply off the high ceiling of the formal dining room. "You ungrateful, arrogant little brat. You owe us everything. You owe us your entire life. If it were not for Harrison taking pity on us, you would have grown up in the gutter. You act like you are so much better than us because you stumbled into a little bit of money, but you are nothing without us. Your biological father was nothing but a worthless, penniless loser who left us with absolutely nothing but a mountain of disappointment. He was a complete failure, and you are acting just like him. We clothed you, we fed you, we allowed you to walk through these halls as if you actually belonged here. You have an absolute obligation to protect this family, and you will sign those commercial properties back over to us immediately. You will drop this ridiculous vendetta and remember exactly who gave you the life you are currently throwing away. You think you can march in here and dictate terms to us in our own home? You are out of your mind. We made you. We gave you access to the best schools and the best social circles. You were nothing before Harrison allowed you to carry our reputation. I will not sit here and let an ungrateful, disrespectful mistake ruin the empire we built. You will do exactly as you are told, Tessa, or you will regret it for the rest of your miserable life. I am your mother, and I demand that you show some basic respect." The next morning arrived with a clear sky. I stayed up late organizing the specific legal filings and printing the exact balance sheets that proved just how deeply underwater the Kensington Empire truly was. I placed them into a fresh leather portfolio and walked down to my garage. The drive out to the ancestral estate usually filled me with a deep, suffocating sense of dread. For my entire life, navigating those winding roads meant heading toward another lecture or casual humiliation. Today, my hands were perfectly steady on the steering wheel. When I reached the massive wrought iron gates of the Kensington estate, the security guard recognized my car immediately and pressed the button to let me through. Harrison had left strict orders to grant me access. I drove up the long driveway, taking a moment to truly look at the property. The mansion was a colossal, intimidating structure built of dark stone. It was designed specifically to make anyone approaching it feel incredibly small and insignificant. I parked my car near the grand entrance, grabbed my portfolio, and walked up the wide stone steps. I did not bother to ring the doorbell. I simply turned the heavy brass handle and let myself in, stepping into the cavernous marble-floored foyer. The house was painfully quiet. It lacked the usual bustling energy of caterers preparing for my mother's high society social events. The profound silence was the sound of a financial empire holding its breath. I walked deliberately down the long hallway, my heels clicking sharply against the polished marble. I headed straight for the formal dining room, knowing exactly where they would choose to stage this confrontation. When I stepped through the arched doorway, I found them waiting. The room was dominated by an enormous antique mahogany table that could comfortably seat 20 guests. My mother and Harrison were seated at the absolute far end, positioned strategically to force me to walk the entire length of the room to reach them. It was a classic corporate intimidation tactic, meant to establish dominance before a single word was spoken. I walked at a leisurely pace, pulling out a chair at the opposite end of the long table and sitting down. I placed my leather portfolio on the polished wood surface in front of me. Beatrice was wearing a tailored cashmere sweater set, projecting the image of a calm, collected matriarch. Harrison sat stiffly beside her, looking noticeably worse than he had in the lobby the day before. The deep, dark circles under his eyes suggested he had not slept since I handed him that notice of default. Bianca was nowhere to be seen, likely banished upstairs, so the adults could handle the massive crisis she had ignited at the country club. I looked directly at my mother and my stepfather, waiting in absolute silence for their performance to begin. "Tessa!" My mother began, her voice dripping with an artificial honeyed sweetness that immediately set my teeth on edge. "Thank you so much for coming home. We know things became a little heated yesterday afternoon, and we want to sincerely apologize for the misunderstanding in your lobby. Harrison was just surprised, that is all. We are actually quite impressed with how well you have done for yourself in the business world. It truly shows that the Kensington work ethic rubbed off on you after all." I did not return her smile. I simply stared at her, letting the sheer absurdity of her statement hang heavily in the air. She was actually trying to take full credit for the wealth I had built completely independently. My mother cleared her throat, her fake smile faltering just a fraction of an inch before she pushed forward with her prepared script. "We asked you here today because we need to remember what truly matters in this world. Money comes and goes, Tessa, but family is forever. Blood is thicker than water. We have always provided for you. We gave you a beautiful home, an excellent education, and a name that carries significant weight. Now the family business has hit a temporary rough patch. The retail market has been brutal lately. We need you to step up and act like a true Kensington. We need you to cancel the collection protocols and forgive the commercial leases your company acquired. We need to keep this in the family. It is simply the only right thing left to do." I listened to her desperate plea, genuinely amazed by the sheer audacity of her request. She was asking me to wipe away tens of millions of dollars in corporate debt simply because we shared biology, the very same biology they had publicly mocked just over a week ago. Harrison leaned forward, attempting to look like a stern but fair father figure, but the raw desperation in his eyes completely ruined the effect. He was silently begging me to save him from total and absolute ruin. I leaned forward slightly, resting my forearms on the cool mahogany table. "Beatrice," I said, making sure my voice was completely devoid of emotion, "I am not a Kensington." Bianca made sure to loudly remind me of that fact in front of half the city. "I am the sole managing partner of a venture capital firm, and your husband is a severely delinquent tenant. I am not here to rescue a family legacy that never included me in the first place. I am here to collect a debt. I will not drop the collection protocols. If the funds are not wired by the end of the entire business day, the stores will be locked." The polite maternal facade shattered into a million pieces. The sudden transformation was violent and immediate. Beatrice slammed both of her hands flat against the table, her manicured nails digging into the polished wood. She shot out of her chair, knocking it backwards so hard it nearly toppled over. Her face contorted with a sudden vicious rage that made the veins in her neck stand out prominently against her pale skin. The sweet, caring mother vanished entirely, replaced by the vicious, controlling woman I had known my entire life. Harrison did not try to calm her down. He sat there, his jaw clenched, fully supporting her verbal assault. "How dare you speak to me like that?" she screamed, her voice echoing sharply off the high ceiling. "You ungrateful, arrogant little brat. You owe us everything. You owe us your entire life. If it were not for Harrison taking pity on us, you would have grown up in the gutter. You act like you are so much better than us because you stumbled into a little bit of money, but you are nothing without us. Your biological father was nothing but a worthless, penniless loser who left us with absolutely nothing. He was a complete failure, and you are acting exactly like him. We clothed you, we fed you, we allowed you to walk through these halls as if you actually belonged here. You will sign those commercial properties back over to us immediately. You will drop this ridiculous vendetta and remember exactly who gave you the life you are currently throwing away. We made you. You were nothing before Harrison allowed you to carry our reputation. I will not sit here and let an ungrateful mistake ruin the empire we built. You will just do exactly as you are told, Tessa. I am your mother. I demand some basic respect. The echoes of her shrill voice bounced off the high ceiling, fading slowly into the heavy, oppressive silence of the dining room. I did not flinch. I did not avert my gaze, and I certainly did not offer the submission she was so desperately trying to force out of me. For my entire childhood, a screaming match with my mother would end with me retreating to my room, apologizing for things I had never even done, just to restore the fragile peace of our household. But the woman sitting across from her today was not that frightened little girl. I watched the rapid rise and fall of her chest as she gasped for breath, her face flushed with a toxic mixture of exertion and pure, unfiltered panic. Harrison shifted uncomfortably in his chair, reaching out to place a restraining hand on her forearm, but she violently yanked her arm away from his grasp. She stood there trembling with rage, waiting for me to break. I offered her a cold, hard smile. It was a smile completely devoid of any affection, a deliberate mirroring of the absolute detachment they had shown me my entire life. I reached out and rested my fingertips on the smooth leather surface of my portfolio. I unzipped the main compartment with a slow, deliberate motion, letting the sharp sound of the metal teeth separating cut through the thick tension in the room. I had come to this mansion fully prepared to dismantle every single lie they had ever told me. I reached inside and pulled out a thick, professionally bound document. It was entirely different from the standard commercial lease default notices I had handed to Harrison the day prior. This document was over 200 pages long, secured with a heavy black binding and stamped with the official seal of a premier independent forensic accounting firm based out of Chicago. I placed my hand flat on top of the heavy document and slid it slowly across the polished mahogany table. The bound edge scraped softly against the wood, a low, ominous sound that seemed to draw all the air out of the room. The thick stack of paper came to a halt precisely between my mother and my stepfather. Harrison stared down at the cover page, his eyes darting across the embossed logo of the accounting firm. As a man who had spent his entire career navigating corporate finances and hiding his own fiscal incompetence, he recognized exactly what kind of document was sitting in front of him. A forensic accounting report was never commissioned for a simple lease dispute. It was a surgical tool used to dig through decades of buried financial history, designed specifically to uncover deeply hidden corporate rot and personal embezzlement. "Go ahead and open it," I said, my voice barely above a whisper yet, carrying enough weight to make Harrison flinch. "I know you both love a good financial narrative, so I decided to commission some light reading for you. It details exactly how you managed to sustain your lavish lifestyle while pretending you were doing me a massive favor by letting me live under your roof." My mother remained standing, her chest heaving, refusing to look down at the document. Harrison, however, could not resist the morbid curiosity. His trembling fingers reached out and flipped open the heavy cardstock cover. He stared at the executive summary, his eyes tracking the dense paragraphs of financial analysis. I watched the remaining color drain from his face as he realized the sheer scope of the investigation I had funded. The accountants had not just looked at the Kensington retail empire. They had dug all the way back to the year my biological father passed away. For over 30 years, I continued my tone conversational, but razor-sharp. "You have relentlessly pushed the narrative that my biological father was a worthless loser. You told me and everyone in your elite social circle that he died completely penniless, leaving you with nothing but debts and a child you had to begrudgingly support. You used his supposed failure as a weapon to make me feel small, to make me feel eternally indebted to the mighty Kensington family for feeding and clothing me. You told me I was a financial burden from the day I was born. Harrison swallowed hard, his eyes glued to a specific spreadsheet on the third page of the report. He knew exactly what I was about to say, and the sheer terror of being exposed paralyzed him completely. The interesting thing about forensic accountants, I said, leaning back in my chair and crossing my arms, is that they do not care about your carefully crafted social narratives. They only care about paper trails routing numbers and wire transfers. And the paper trail they uncovered was absolutely fascinating. It turns out my father did not die penniless at all. In fact, he had a very robust, extremely comprehensive life insurance policy. A policy that named me as the sole direct beneficiary in the event of his passing. My mother finally looked down at the document, her eyes widening as the truth was laid bare on the table. She slowly sank back down into her dining chair, her legs seemingly unable to support her weight any longer. Because I was a minor when he died, I explained, keeping my gaze locked firmly on my mother. The life insurance payout was legally placed into a protected trust. You, Beatrice, were named as the custodian of that trust, with the strict legal obligation to manage those funds exclusively for my health, my education, and my eventual adulthood. But that is not what you did, is it? I stood up from my chair and began to pace slowly near my end of the table, letting the rhythm of my footsteps emphasize my words. The accountants tracked every single withdrawal, every wire transfer, and every hidden transaction you executed over the last 2 decades. You and Harrison methodically drained my biological father's life insurance policy down to the very last cent. You treated my inheritance like your own personal slush fund. That is a complete fabrication, my mother stammered, her voice shaking violently. We used that money to raise you. Children are expensive. We provided you with a premium lifestyle. I stopped pacing and laughed. It was a cold, harsh sound that held absolutely no humor. You did not use a single dime of that money on me, I countered, pointing a finger directly at the bound report. The forensic trace proves exactly where those funds were diverted. You funneled hundreds of thousands of dollars out of my trust to pay for your youngest daughter's extravagant lifestyle. You used my dead father's money to pay for the down payment on her luxury sports car. You used it to fund her month-long vacations in Europe. You even used my inheritance to pay for the massive, ridiculous ice sculpture and the imported flowers at her lavish engagement party. Harrison tried to close the report, as if hiding the pages would somehow erase the reality of his actions, but his hands were shaking too badly to grasp the cover. And let us not forget your contribution, Harrison, I said, turning my sharp focus onto my stepfather, the man who loves to brag about his brilliant business acumen. The report clearly shows that when your personal stock market trades started tanking a decade ago, you authorized a series of illegal internal transfers. You pulled over $1 million out of my trust account to cover your massive margin calls and hide your catastrophic financial failures from your own board of directors. You stole from a child to save your own fragile ego. Neither of them spoke. The crushing weight of the undeniable evidence had entirely suffocated their ability to spin the truth. They were staring at a document that proved they were not the generous, wealthy benefactors they pretended to be. They were common thieves who had exploited a grieving child to fund their own reckless greed. For years, I said, my voice dropping to a low, dangerous tone, you loved to remind me how grateful I should be. You loved to tell your country club friends that you had to subsidize my startup phase in my 20s. You claimed you generously funded my business ventures while I tried to figure out my life. You used that lie to make yourselves look like patient, supportive parents dealing with a wayward daughter. I walked back to my chair and placed both of my hands firmly on the top of the mahogany table, leaning in close so they could see the absolute conviction burning in my eyes. You didn't fund my startup, I stated, enunciating every single syllable with crystal clear precision. I built my company from the ground up while waiting tables and working night shifts. I did not take a single penny from the Kensington family. But you did steal my inheritance. You stole my future to fund your own pathetic illusions of grandeur. And now every single thing you bought with my money is going to be ripped away from you. The echoes of her shrill voice bounced off the high ceiling, fading slowly into the silence of the dining room. I did not flinch or avert my gaze, and I certainly did not offer the submission she was so desperately trying to force out of me. For my entire childhood, a screaming match with my mother would end with me retreating to my room, apologizing for things I had never done just to restore peace. But the woman sitting across from her today was not that frightened little girl. I watched her chest heave as she gasped for breath, her face flushed with pure panic. Harrison reached out to place a restraining hand on her forearm, but she violently yanked her arm away. She stood there trembling with rage, waiting for me to break. I offered her a cold, hard smile, a deliberate mirroring of the detachment they had shown me my entire life. I reached out and rested my fingertips on the smooth leather surface of my portfolio. I unzipped the main compartment with a slow motion, letting the sharp sound of the metal teeth cut through the thick tension. I had come prepared to dismantle every lie they had ever told me. I reached inside and pulled out a thick, professionally bound document. It was entirely different from the commercial lease default notices I had handed to Harrison. This document was over 200 pages long, secured with a heavy black binding, and stamped with the official seal of a forensic accounting firm based out of Chicago. I placed my hand flat on top of the heavy document and slid it slowly across the polished mahogany table. The bound edge scraped softly against the wood, an ominous sound that seemed to draw the air out of the room. The thick stack of paper came to a halt precisely between my mother and my stepfather. Harrison stared down at the cover page, his eyes darting across the embossed logo of the accounting firm. As a man who spent his career hiding his fiscal incompetence, he recognized exactly what kind of document sat in front of him. It was a surgical tool used to dig through decades of buried financial history, designed specifically to uncover deeply hidden personal embezzlement. "Go ahead and open it," I said, my voice barely above a whisper, yet carrying enough weight to make Harrison flinch. "I know you both love a good financial narrative, so I decided to commission some light reading for you. It details how you managed to sustain your lavish lifestyle while pretending you were doing me a massive favor by letting me live here." My mother remained standing, refusing to look at the document. Harrison, however, could not resist. His trembling fingers reached out and flipped open the heavy cover. He stared at the executive summary, his eyes tracking the dense paragraphs of financial analysis. I watched the remaining color drain from his face as he realized the sheer scope of the investigation I had funded. The accountants had dug all the way back to the year my biological father passed away. For over 30 years, I continued my tone conversational, but razor sharp. "You have relentlessly pushed the narrative that my biological father was a worthless loser. You told everyone in your elite social circle that he died penniless, leaving you with nothing but debts and a child you had to begrudgingly support. You used his supposed failure as a weapon to make me feel small, to make me feel eternally indebted to the mighty Kensington family." Harrison swallowed hard, his eyes glued to a specific spreadsheet on the third page of the report. He knew exactly what I was about to say, and the sheer terror of being exposed paralyzed him completely. "The interesting thing about forensic accountants," I said, leaning back, "is that they do not care about your carefully crafted social narratives. They only care about paper trails and wire transfers." And the paper trail they uncovered was absolutely fascinating. It turns out my father did not die penniless at all. In fact, he had an extremely comprehensive life insurance policy. A policy that named me as the sole direct beneficiary in the event of his passing. My mother finally looked down at the document, her eyes widening as the truth was laid bare on the table. She slowly sank back down into her dining chair, her legs seemingly unable to support her weight any longer. "Because I was a minor when he died," I explained. Keeping my gaze locked firmly on my mother, the life insurance payout was legally placed into a protected trust. You, Beatrice, were named as the custodian of that trust, with the strict legal obligation to manage those funds exclusively for my health and education. But that is not what you did, is it? I stood up from my chair and began to pace slowly near my end of the table. The accountants tracked every single withdrawal, every wire transfer, and every hidden transaction you executed over the last 2 decades. You and Harrison methodically drained my biological father's life insurance policy down to the very last cent. You treated my inheritance like your own personal slush fund. "That is a complete fabrication," my mother stammered, her voice shaking violently. We used that money to raise you. Children are expensive. We provided you with a premium lifestyle. I stopped pacing and laughed. It was a cold, harsh sound. You did not use a single dime of that money on me. I countered, pointing a finger directly at the bound report. The forensic trace proves exactly where those funds were diverted. You funneled hundreds of thousands of dollars out of my trust to pay for your youngest daughter's extravagant lifestyle. You used my dead father's money to pay for the down payment on her luxury sports car. You used it to fund her month-long vacations in Europe and her lavish engagement party. Harrison tried to close the report as if hiding the pages would somehow erase the reality of his actions, but his hands were shaking too badly to grasp the cover. And let us not forget your contribution, Harrison, I said, turning my sharp focus onto my stepfather, the man who loves to brag about his brilliant business acumen. The report clearly shows that when your personal stock market trades started tanking a decade ago, you authorized a series of illegal internal transfers. You pulled over $1 million out of my trust account to cover your massive margin calls and hide your catastrophic financial failures. You stole from a child to save your own fragile ego. Neither of them spoke. The crushing weight of the undeniable evidence had entirely suffocated their ability to spin the truth. They were staring at a document that proved they were common thieves who had exploited a grieving child to fund their own reckless greed. For years, I said, my voice dropping to a low, dangerous tone, you loved to remind me how grateful I should be. You claimed you generously funded my business ventures while I tried to figure out my life. You used that lie to make yourselves look like patient, supportive parents dealing with a wayward daughter. I walked back to my chair and placed both of my hands firmly on the top of the mahogany table, leaning in close so they could see the absolute conviction burning in my eyes. You didn't fund my startup, I stated, enunciating every single syllable with crystal clear precision. I built my company from the ground up while waiting tables and working night shifts. I did not take a single penny from the Kensington family. But you did steal my inheritance. You stole my future to fund your own pathetic illusions of grandeur, and now every single thing you bought with my money is going to be ripped away from you. I watched as the immense gravity of my statement settled over them like a thick, suffocating winter fog. Harrison was practically gasping for air, his chest heaving irregularly, as if the oxygen in the formal dining room had suddenly burned away. He reached up and loosened his expensive silk tie with trembling fingers, his eyes darting frantically around the room, looking for an exit, a legal loophole, any possible way to escape the corner he had so eagerly backed himself into. He had genuinely thought he could intimidate me with threats of public exposure, relying heavily on his tired playbook of corporate bullying. He thought he possessed the ultimate leverage over a wayward daughter. I reached into my leather portfolio one final time and pulled out a single, neatly folded piece of official government correspondence. I placed it gently on top of the massive forensic accounting report. I did not keep this financial investigation a secret, I said, keeping my voice incredibly calm and measured against the chaotic backdrop of their rising panic. I did not just commission these forensic accountants to satisfy my own personal curiosity about my biological father, or to simply prove a point at this dining table. I had my legal team compile every single fraudulent transfer, every fake invoice, and every unauthorized withdrawal you executed from my trust over the last 20 years. I had them package it all into a highly detailed, legally binding dossier. I paused, letting the heavy silence stretch out for a few agonizing seconds, before delivering the final fatal blow. And then I forwarded the entire dossier directly to the Internal Revenue Service. Harrison let out a pathetic sound that was half gasp, half sob. His broad shoulders slumped forward and his trembling hands dropped heavily onto the polished mahogany table, his entire posture crumbling inward. "You do not have any leverage over me, Harrison," I told him, watching the sheer unadulterated terror completely consume his features. "You have a federal tax fraud audit." Beatrice let out a sharp, devastated wail that echoed painfully off the high ceilings. She buried her face in her manicured hands, her shoulders shaking violently as the reality of federal criminal charges destroyed her pristine, carefully manufactured reality. She knew exactly what a federal audit meant for people operating in their specific social circles. It meant frozen bank accounts, seized assets, and a highly publicized trial that would turn the Kensington family into an absolute laughingstock among the Connecticut elite. The social exile alone would break her spirit completely, but the very real prospect of a federal prison sentence for her husband was actively making her hyperventilate. I felt absolutely no pity for either of them. They had spent decades building their glamorous, untouchable lives on top of a mountain of stolen money, all while treating the person they stole it from like worthless dirt. I slowly gathered my documents, slipping the commercial lease default notices and the IRS correspondence back into my leather portfolio. I zipped it closed with a smooth, decisive motion that signaled the absolute end of our conversation. I strongly suggest you spend the rest of your day contacting a very good criminal defense attorney, I said, standing up from my chair and pushing it back into place. I will expect the commercial lease payments wired into my holding company account by the end of the business day. If they are not, my property, managers will lock the glass doors of every single retail store you operate before the sun rises tomorrow. I turned my back on them and walked away, leaving them completely paralyzed by the crushing weight of their own greed. As I approached the grand arched doorway of the formal dining room, the heavy wooden doors suddenly swung open. Bianca stood there in a silk robe, clutching her smartphone to her chest, her face a mask of absolute horror. She had clearly been standing in the marble hallway, eavesdropping on the entire explosive confrontation. The smug, arrogant sister who had happily presented me with a genetic testing kit just over a week ago was completely gone. She stared at me, her eyes wide and frantic, looking like a frightened child who had just watched her universe collapse into dust. She looked past me into the dining room, seeing our mother sobbing uncontrollably and her seemingly invincible father gasping for air. The truth of her luxurious lifestyle had just been brutally exposed. Every designer handbag, every first-class European vacation, and every drop of vintage champagne she had ever consumed was paid for with my stolen inheritance. She stepped aside as I walked through the doorway, her mouth opening and closing silently as she struggled to find words that simply did not exist. I did not stop to acknowledge her presence. I kept my head held high, walking down the long, echoing marble hallway and out the front doors of the estate, leaving the wreckage of the Kensington family far behind me. But Bianca was not accustomed to losing, and she was certainly not accustomed to facing severe consequences for her actions. As the terrifying reality of her impending poverty set in, her initial shock quickly morphed into a desperate, vicious panic. She rushed up the sweeping staircase to her massive bedroom suite, looking frantically at the expensive clothes and imported jewelry she was suddenly terrified of losing forever. She knew her father was completely ruined. She knew her mother's elite social standing was obliterated. But she still believed she had one massive, unbeatable card left to play. Bianca locked her solid oak bedroom door and immediately dialed her fiancé, Cameron. Cameron was a notoriously ruthless tech executive, a man who had built his own multi-billion-dollar software company before the age of 35. He was deeply arrogant, incredibly wealthy, and known throughout the corporate world for crushing his business competition with absolutely no mercy. Bianca knew Cameron despised weakness, so she carefully crafted a manipulative, tearful narrative to secure his financial protection. She sobbed hysterically into the phone, spinning a wild, fabricated story about how I had suddenly lost my mind. She claimed I was using sketchy legal loopholes to blackmail her aging parents out of their hard-earned retail business, and that I was trying to leave her homeless right before their lavish wedding. She played the role of the innocent, terrified victim perfectly, knowing exactly how to stroke Cameron's massive ego and trigger his savior complex. She begged him to step in, pleading with him to use his immense corporate influence and his limitless billions to utterly destroy my venture capital firm. Cameron, blinded by his profound arrogance and his desire to play the wealthy hero for his beautiful fiancée, eagerly accepted the challenge. He promised Bianca that he would personally ensure my absolute financial ruin. He assured her that a nobody like me playing around with what he assumed was a minor pool of money stood absolutely no chance against a titan of the modern tech industry. He boasted that he could dismantle my entire operation with a few phone calls to his aggressive banking contacts. He told her to dry her tears, promising to handle me swiftly and brutally before the end of the week. He hung up the phone, intending to crush me into dust, unaware that the proxy war he had just declared was setting the stage for a spectacular collision that neither of them could possibly anticipate. 3 days after the disastrous confrontation in the formal dining room, the city hosted its most anticipated social event of the season. It was the annual Children's Hospital Charity Gala, a glittering affair held in the grand ballroom of a historic downtown hotel. I had purchased a charity table months in advance, long before the genetic test or the commercial lease defaults had entered the picture. I arrived wearing a floor-length emerald silk gown, projecting an aura of absolute calm as I mingled with various colleagues and clients. The ballroom was a sea of expensive tuxedos and designer dresses, but I was not there to socialize with the old money crowd. I was simply making an appearance to support a philanthropic cause I actually cared about. I had just excused myself from a polite conversation with a local philanthropist and stepped into a quiet, dimly lit alcove near the terrace doors to check my messages. That was when I heard the heavy, deliberate footsteps approaching me from behind. I turned around to find Cameron stepping into the secluded alcove, completely blocking my only exit. Cameron was a man who moved through the world with the obnoxious entitlement of a tech billionaire who had experienced too much success at too young an age. He was wearing a custom velvet tuxedo jacket, holding a tumbler of scotch, and looking at me with an expression of pure, unadulterated contempt. He had clearly spent the last 3 days absorbing every single one of Bianca's hysterical, fabricated lies. He saw himself as the heroic, ruthless savior rushing in to rescue his beautiful fiancée from her supposedly unhinged and vindictive older sister. He took a sip of his scotch, his eyes sweeping over me dismissively before he finally spoke. "You have caused quite a bit of unnecessary drama this week, Tessa," he began, his voice dripping with condescension. "Bianca has barely stopped crying since you barged into her parents' house and threatened to ruin them over some petty childhood grudge." I did not respond immediately. I simply maintained my calm composure, allowing him to dig his own grave. "I thought about having my security team throw you out of this gala," he continued, taking a step closer to invade my personal space. "But I decided it would be much more effective to handle this little temper tantrum of yours personally. You see, Bianca told me all about your sudden delusions of grandeur. She told me about your cute little venture capital firm and how you managed to acquire a few of Harrison's commercial leases. You think you have somehow outsmarted a family institution? But you are playing a very dangerous game with people who are entirely out of your league." Cameron swirled the amber liquid in his glass, leaning casually against the silk wallpaper of the alcove. "I have spent the last decade building a multinational software empire," he boasted, his arrogance filling the narrow space. "I sit on the boards of 3 major banks. I have the power to freeze your credit lines, blacklist your firm from every legitimate investment circle in this city, and crush your entire operation before the market even opens on Monday. You are a nobody playing with big money, Tessa. You are a minor inconvenience that I can squash with a single phone call." He leaned in closer, his jaw tightening into a cruel sneer. "Here is exactly what is going to happen. You are going to drop this ridiculous debt collection against Harrison immediately. You are going to call off your little tax fraud audit, and then you are going to get down on your knees and beg Bianca for forgiveness. If you refuse, I promise you that I will personally bankrupt your firm within the week. You will lose everything you claim to have built, and you will be right back to waiting tables." I stood perfectly still in the dim lighting of the alcove, letting the absolute arrogance of his ultimatum wash over me. I did not raise my voice. I did not cross my arms defensively, and I certainly did not show a single ounce of fear. Cameron was expecting a fight. He wanted me to argue to defend my business or to shrink back in terror under the crushing weight of his massive corporate influence. He was an arrogant man who thrived on bullying vulnerable people into submission, using his vast wealth as a weapon to protect his fragile ego and his manipulative fiancée. I took a slow, deep breath, maintaining steady and unflinching eye contact with him. I reached into my small evening clutch and pulled out my smartphone. I slowly unlocked the glass screen and carefully opened a highly secured encrypted application that required a secondary biometric scan to access. I did not say a word as I navigated through the complex folders of my holding company's private server. Cameron watched me with a look of mild irritation, clearly annoyed that I was not reacting to his threats with the appropriate level of panic. "You can check your fragile bank accounts all you want," he scoffed, shaking his head. "It will not save you." I ignored his taunt completely. I found the exact document I was looking for and tapped the screen to open it. It was a comprehensive internal capitalization table, a highly confidential financial ledger that detailed the exact ownership structure of a major corporation. It listed every major shareholder, every voting bloc, and the precise percentage of equity controlled by various anonymous entities. I held the phone out, turning the brightly lit screen so it was facing directly at his chest. "I suggest you take a very close look at this document, Cameron," I said, my voice carrying a quiet, dangerous authority that immediately wiped the smug smile off his face. "I believe you will recognize the corporate letterhead at the top of the page." Cameron frowned, his brow furrowing as he leaned in to look at the glowing screen. His eyes darted to the top of the digital document, recognizing the official logo of his own multinational tech company. He let out a short, confused breath, his eyes scanning the detailed list of majority shareholders holding the voting rights to his entire life's work. "For the past 6 months, a mysterious shell company has been aggressively buying up massive blocks of voting shares from your early investors and your disgruntled board members," I explained, keeping my tone perfectly even. "You have been frantically trying to identify the hostile buyer behind this aggressive proxy war, completely unaware of who was actively orchestrating the takeover from the shadows." I watched his eyes track down the list until he saw the name of the primary backer controlling the shell company. It was the exact same venture capital firm he had just threatened to bankrupt. The color drained from Cameron's face, instantly replacing his arrogant flush with a sickly, terrified pallor. The tumbler of scotch in his hand began to tremble violently, the ice cubes clinking loudly in the quiet alcove. He looked up from the screen, his mouth opening and closing as his brain completely short-circuited. "I am not playing with big money, Cameron," I whispered, stepping closer so he could hear the absolute, unbreakable certainty in my voice. "I am the money. Your board of directors is holding an emergency meeting tomorrow morning, and they already have the necessary votes to remove you as chief executive officer. You just threatened the very person who holds the keys to your entire corporate existence. You do not have the power to crush my firm because my firm currently owns you." Cameron stood frozen against the silk wallpaper, the devastating reality of his profound hubris crashing down on him. He had marched into this alcove intending to destroy a helpless woman to impress his fiancée. Instead, he had just handed his own executioner the final justification needed to pull the heavy lever. I lowered my phone, slipping it back into my evening clutch, and walked out of the alcove, leaving him gasping for air alone in the dark. I stepped out of the dim alcove and seamlessly blended back into the glittering crowd of the grand ballroom. I did not look back over my shoulder. I simply accepted a fresh glass of sparkling water from a passing waiter and positioned myself near a towering floral arrangement where I had a clear, unobstructed view of the terrace doors. It took Cameron less than 2 minutes to stumble out of the shadows. The arrogant, untouchable tech billionaire who had just threatened to destroy my entire life was completely gone. In his place was a frantic, terrified man whose custom velvet tuxedo suddenly looked entirely too large for his shrinking frame. He was practically vibrating with panic, his eyes darting wildly across the crowded ballroom as he desperately searched for the nearest exit. He did not care about social graces anymore. He shoved past a group of wealthy philanthropists, ignoring their indignant gasps as he made a straight line for the main doors. Bianca spotted him from across the room. She had been holding court near the silent auction tables, likely waiting for her handsome fiancé to return with the news that he had successfully terrified me into submission. She smiled brightly and waved, stepping into his path with her arms outstretched. I watched from a distance as Cameron practically collided with her. He did not offer her a warm embrace. He grabbed her by the upper arm and pulled her roughly to the side, his face contorted with a mixture of raw fear and explosive anger. Bianca lost her footing slightly, her smile vanishing as she saw the sheer panic sweating through his pores. Even from across the ballroom, without hearing a single word of their conversation, the dynamic of their entire relationship was laid completely bare. Cameron was fiercely gesturing toward the exit, shaking his head violently as Bianca tried to grab his hand. He looked at her not with the adoration of a man in love, but with the cold, calculating detachment of an executive discarding a toxic liability. The sheer brutality of his sudden rejection was absolute, leaving absolutely no room for negotiation or pleading. He was abandoning her. The realization hit Bianca like a physical blow. She reached out desperately, trying to cling to his velvet sleeve, pleading with him in front of half the ballroom. But Cameron knew that his entire corporate empire, his fortune, and his legacy were currently hanging by a fragile thread that I completely controlled. He knew that any continued association with the Kensington family was financial suicide. He ripped his arm away from her grasp with a sudden vicious force that made several nearby guests turn and stare. He did not look back at her. He sprinted through the grand double doors of the ballroom, fleeing the charity gala, to frantically call his board of directors and attempt to save his own skin. Bianca was left standing completely alone in the center of the crowded room. The women she had just been boasting to were now whispering behind their champagne flutes, watching the golden child of the Kensington family suffer a spectacular and highly public humiliation. I set my water glass down on a passing tray and walked quietly out a side exit, leaving her to drown in the awkward, suffocating stares of her social circle. The next morning arrived with a crisp, clear sky that felt entirely appropriate for the reckoning that was about to unfold. I was sitting in my downtown office reviewing the final preparations with my legal team when the notifications began to populate on my secure server. Gregory, the most prestigious and feared estate lawyer in the entire state, had officially sent out the formal legal summons. Gregory was an institution in Connecticut. He managed the generational wealth and impenetrable trusts of the oldest money in the city. Getting summoned to his high-rise office was never a casual affair. The courier service delivered the thick wax-sealed envelopes directly to the Kensington ancestral estate, precisely at 9 in the morning. I could easily picture the scene unfolding in their massive foyer. Harrison and Beatrice, still paralyzed by the crippling reality of their commercial lease defaults and the looming threat of a federal tax fraud audit, would have torn open the heavy envelopes with trembling, desperate hands. Bianca, nursing the fresh, agonizing wound of being publicly abandoned by her billionaire fiancé the night before, would have read the summons over their shoulders. The subject line of the formal legal document was printed in bold, uncompromising black ink. It read, "Urgent meeting regarding the legal verification of the DNA of Tessa." That single, carefully phrased subject line was the ultimate bait. It was designed specifically to exploit their massive egos and their profound, unrelenting arrogance. It was a masterclass in psychological manipulation, carefully calculated to make them willingly walk into the slaughterhouse. They were so blinded by their own prejudice that they could not see the massive legal anvil swinging directly toward their heads. Instead of reading the summons as a warning, they read it as their ultimate salvation. The human mind is incredibly adept at seeing exactly what it wants to see, especially when it is backed into a desperate corner. Harrison and Beatrice had spent my entire life convincing themselves that I was an illegitimate mistake, an outsider with absolutely no claim to their refined world. When they saw the words DNA verification on a formal summons from the most powerful estate lawyer in the state, their panic instantly transformed into a delusion of absolute victory. In their minds, there was only one possible reason for Gregory to summon them regarding my genetics. They genuinely believed that the commercial DNA kit Bianca had forced upon me at the country club had officially proven that I possessed no ties to any significant family lineage. They assumed that Gregory had somehow found a massive sweeping legal loophole. They convinced themselves that because my DNA proved I was not a Kensington, they could legally invalidate my ownership of the holding company, seize my venture capital firm as restitution for my insubordination, and magically wipe away all of their catastrophic commercial debts. It was a completely irrational leap of logic born entirely of desperation and entitlement, but they embraced it as undeniable fact. They needed a villain to blame for their own spectacular failures, and they eagerly cast me in the role. The thought of punishing me eclipsed every other rational thought in their panicked minds. The sudden surge of false hope breathed new life into their collapsing empire. According to my private security team monitoring the estate, the mood in the Kensington mansion shifted from suffocating despair to vindictive celebration in a matter of minutes. Beatrice rushed upstairs to select her most intimidating designer suit, eager to watch me be legally stripped of my assets. Harrison poured himself a generous glass of morning scotch, his chest puffed out with the arrogant belief that the universe was finally restoring the natural order of things. Bianca, desperate to reclaim her dignity after Cameron had fled the gala, put on her most expensive pearls and prepared to watch me beg for mercy. They were completely blind to the reality of their situation. At exactly 11 in the morning, their luxury black sedan pulled up to the towering glass skyscraper that housed Gregory's elite law firm. They stepped out of the vehicle, with their heads held obnoxiously high. They walked through the pristine lobby and stepped into the private elevator like conquering heroes arriving to collect their spoils of war. The heavy glass doors of the building closed behind them, shutting out the bustling noise and sealing them inside the cold, quiet sanctuary of absolute legal power. They felt completely untouchable. The receptionist, a polished woman wearing a sharp navy blue suit and a discreet pearl necklace, barely looked up from her glowing monitor as she directed them toward the primary conference room at the end of the long, art-lined corridor. Harrison led the way, his chest puffed out in a pathetic display of manufactured bravado, while Beatrice trailed closely behind him, her designer heels clicking rhythmically against the imported hardwood floor. Bianca brought up the rear, clutching a luxury handbag against her chest, as if it were a protective shield against the massive public humiliation she had suffered the previous evening. The rich, earthy scent of polished mahogany and expensive leather filled the air, a scent they instantly associated entirely with their own perceived superiority and social dominance. They pushed open the heavy frosted glass doors of the executive conference room and stepped inside, fully expecting to be greeted with the absolute deference they believed they were inherently owed. The room was truly breathtaking, featuring massive floor-to-ceiling windows that offered a panoramic, unobstructed view of the entire city skyline bathed in the crisp morning light. At the center of the room sat a massive custom-built oval table surrounded by high-backed ergonomic leather chairs. Gregory, a man in his late 60s with perfectly groomed silver hair and an impeccable tailored suit, sat at the head of the table. He was organizing a stack of thick watermarked folders with slow, precise movements that commanded instant respect. I was seated halfway down the table, my hands folded neatly in my lap, wearing a simple but sharp emerald green dress. I did not stand up when they entered. I did not even blink. I simply watched them march into the room entirely consumed by their own massive, unchecked delusions. Harrison immediately pulled out the chair directly to Gregory's right, aggressively claiming the position of highest authority for himself. He sat down heavily, adjusting his expensive silk tie with a sharp, angry tug. Beatrice glided gracefully into the seat beside him, placing her expensive handbag on the table with a loud, deliberate thud that was clearly meant to command attention from everyone in the room. Bianca sat directly across from me. Her eyes were red-rimmed and puffy, a lingering, undeniable sign of the brutal, callous rejection she had endured from Cameron the night before, but her gaze was currently filled with a toxic, vindictive energy. She glared at me, her upper lip curling into a familiar, cruel sneer. They were practically vibrating with malicious excitement, completely convinced that they had successfully cornered their prey and were about to deliver the final killing blow. Gregory did not offer them coffee or sparkling water. He did not exchange pleasantries or ask about their morning commute from the suburbs. He simply closed the heavy folder in front of him, folded his hands on top of it, and looked at Harrison over the rim of his reading glasses. "Thank you for coming on such short notice." Gregory began, his voice deep and resonant, carrying the absolute authority of a man who had navigated the complex legal battlegrounds of the Connecticut elite for over 40 years. As the subject line of your formal summons indicated, we are here today to discuss a highly urgent matter regarding the genetic verification of Tessa. Beatrice did not even wait for him to finish his introductory sentence. She leaned forward, her eyes flashing with a predatory, vicious gleam, fully ready to unleash the arrogant demands she had been rehearsing all morning in front of her vanity mirror. "We appreciate you handling this so swiftly, Gregory." My mother interrupted, her voice dripping with a sickly sweet condescension that made my skin crawl. "We always knew it would eventually come to this necessary breaking point. We have been incredibly generous, allowing her to operate under the protective, prestigious umbrella of our family name for all these years, despite her many obvious shortcomings. But after her recent erratic behavior, her absolute disrespect toward her father, and her ridiculous illegal attempts to extort our business, we are putting a permanent end to her little charade today." Gregory raised a single distinguished silver eyebrow, his expression remaining completely unreadable. He did not say a word, allowing Beatrice to hang herself with her own rope. "We want you to draft the paperwork immediately." My mother continued, her tone growing sharper, more demanding, vibrating with entitlement. "We are officially severing all legal and familial ties with Tessa. We want it completely documented that she is not and has never been a true member of this family. But more importantly, Gregory, we are here today to discuss proper financial restitution." Harrison nodded firmly in agreement, leaning his heavy frame against the conference table. "This woman has caused significant emotional and financial distress to our retail operations over the last 48 hours, he stated, his voice booming across the quiet room. She used stolen funds and deceptive corporate practices to illegally acquire our commercial leases. She has been operating a rogue venture capital firm using resources she siphoned directly from the financial support we so graciously provided her during her turbulent 20s. I sat perfectly still, listening to the sheer, unparalleled audacity of their fabricated narrative. They were genuinely trying to convince the most powerful estate lawyer in the state that I had built a multi-billion-dollar holding company using the metaphorical table scraps they had tossed my way during my childhood. They were trying to seamlessly spin their own horrific financial crimes into a tragic story where they were the innocent victims of an ungrateful, manipulative child. Therefore, my mother declared, tapping her manicured index finger against the mahogany wood for aggressive emphasis, "We demand that her venture capital firm and all of its associated real estate holdings be seized and transferred directly to Harrison's exclusive control. It is the only fair and legal restitution for her profound insubordination and the terrible damage she has attempted to inflict upon our brand. You will draft the asset transfer documents right now, Gregory. We want her completely stripped of every single penny she claims to own. We want her left with absolutely nothing but the clothes on her back." Bianca let out a short, harsh laugh. She leaned across the table, her eyes locking onto mine with a look of pure, unadulterated hatred. She desperately needed a massive victory to soothe the agonizing sting of being abandoned by her billionaire fiancé, and she fully believed she was about to get one handed to her on a silver platter. "You really thought you were so incredibly smart, Tessa," Bianca sneered, her voice echoing loudly in the spacious room. "You thought you could march into our lobby and threaten my father. You thought you could ruin my engagement by intimidating Cameron with your fake little shell companies. But you forgot one tiny crucial detail in your pathetic little master plan. You forgot that you do not belong here. You are nothing but a common fraud playing dress-up. She reached into her designer purse and dramatically pulled out the brightly colored cardboard box containing the commercial DNA kit. She slammed it down onto the table, pushing it toward the center so Gregory could see it clearly. That little birthday gift I gave you was the smartest thing I have ever done. Bianca gloated, her smile wide and viciously triumphant. It finally proved exactly what we have known all along. The genetic test proves you have absolutely no biological connection to the Kensington legacy. You have no legal right to use our name, and you certainly have no right to touch our properties. That little plastic swab just exposed you as the absolute nobody you truly are. You are a mistake, Tessa. You are just a stray dog we took in out of pity, and now we are officially kicking you back out onto the street where you belong. The room fell into a heavy, suspended silence. Beatrice and Harrison looked incredibly pleased with themselves, offering Bianca nods of profound approval for her aggressive outburst. They sat back in their plush, ergonomic chairs, crossing their arms and waiting for Gregory to slide the forfeiture documents across the table. They expected me to start crying, to beg for mercy, to plead with them to let me keep even a tiny fraction of my company. They wanted to watch me break into a million jagged pieces right there in the law office. I did not break. I did not shed a single tear. I simply turned my head and looked calmly at Gregory. I gave him a subtle, almost imperceptible nod. Gregory sighed deeply, a heavy, tired sound that carried decades of exhaustion from dealing with the profound arrogance of old money families. He reached up and slowly removed his reading glasses, placing them neatly next to his watermarked folders. He looked at Beatrice, then at Harrison, and finally at Bianca. His expression was no longer one of polite professional detachment. It was a look of cold, clinical pity. He was looking at three people who were completely oblivious to the fact that they were standing directly on a live landmine. He did not reach for his expensive pen to draft their ridiculous demands. He did not acknowledge Beatrice's commanding tone or Harrison's booming corporate threats. He simply rested his hands on the table and prepared to systematically dismantle their entire universe piece by piece. Gregory let the heavy silence stretch out for another long moment. He looked down at the brightly colored cardboard box sitting in the center of his conference table, then shifted his gaze back to the three people sitting across from him. He did not look angry, nor did he look intimidated by the demands Beatrice had just screamed at him. He looked like a man about to deliver a fatal diagnosis. I watched his calm demeanor, feeling the steady rhythm of my own heartbeat. The trap was fully set, and they were completely oblivious to the impending disaster right now. I must admit, Gregory began, his voice perfectly measured and calm. When my office was notified that a commercial genetic test had been registered under Tessa's name, I was quite surprised. We had been trying to legally compel a biological sample for the better part of a decade, but you saved us a tremendous amount of legal maneuvering by gifting it to her directly. For that, my firm owes you a profound debt of gratitude. Bianca blinked, the vicious smile faltering on her lips. She looked at her mother, then back at the lawyer with utter confusion and shock. "What are you talking about?" she stammered. "It proves she has no Kensington blood. It proves she has no right to anything in this family." "You are entirely correct about the first part," Gregory said smoothly. "She does not possess a single drop of Kensington blood. But your assumption regarding her legal rights is where you have made a catastrophic miscalculation." Gregory reached for the thickest watermarked folder sitting in his neat stack. He opened it slowly, revealing pages of dense, tightly typed legal text stamped with official county seals. He smoothed the heavy papers with very careful hands now. For the past 30 years, Gregory continued addressing Beatrice and Harrison. "You have operated under the assumption that Tessa's biological father passed away, leaving behind nothing but a modest life insurance policy. You told everyone he was a financial failure. You convinced yourselves of this narrative so thoroughly that you never once bothered to look into the actual source of the funds you were quietly draining from her custodial accounts. Beatrice shifted uncomfortably in her leather chair. He was a failure, she insisted, though her voice lacked its previous venom. He was just a nobody from a truly terrible background. He was a man who valued absolute privacy over public validation, Gregory corrected her sharply. A trait that you and your husband clearly do not share. Tessa's father did not care about country club memberships or society pages. He cared about acquiring hard, tangible assets. He was, in fact, one of the most prolific and quietly successful commercial real estate developers in the entire Northeast. Harrison let out a short, dismissive breath. That is impossible. We would have known. I know every major player in the commercial real estate sector in this state. You are completely making all this up. You know the people who want to be known, Harrison. Gregory replied, his tone dripping with professional disdain. Tessa's father operated exclusively through a complex network of blind trusts and anonymous holding companies. He bought up massive parcels of undeveloped land decades before the urban sprawl reached them. He owned the ground before anyone else even realized it was valuable. Gregory pulled a specific document from his folder and slid it toward the center of the table. It was a certified copy of a birth certificate, alongside a highly classified trust mandate bearing my biological father's authentic signature right now. When he passed away, Gregory explained he left behind two distinct financial entities. The first was the liquid life insurance policy, which he left exposed and easily accessible specifically to serve as a decoy. He knew exactly what kind of people you were. He knew you would immediately drain whatever cash you could get your hands on. He sacrificed that life insurance policy to keep you entirely distracted from his true legacy. Beatrice stared at the document on the table, her hands trembling slightly. His true legacy, she repeated the words, tasting like sour ash in her very dry mouth. The second financial entity, Gregory said, leaning forward and resting his elbows on the polished wood, was an impenetrable, irrevocable generational trust. This trust contained his entire real estate portfolio. It was legally sealed and strictly managed by my firm for the last 2 decades. The stipulations of this trust were incredibly specific and completely unbreakable. The vast assets within it could only be transferred to his sole biological heir upon her 33rd birthday, provided her identity was genetically confirmed and matched to the state registry. Gregory paused, letting his eyes meet Bianca's completely horrified gaze right now. Your little birthday joke was the exact key we needed to finally execute the transfer. As of last week, the genetic verification was authenticated. The generational trust has been fully vested. Tessa is now the sole undisputed owner of a real estate empire that dwarfs the Kensington retail portfolio by several magnitudes. Harrison's face had gone a sickening shade of gray. He looked at me sitting quietly at the end of the table and then back at Gregory. Even if that absurd story is true, Harrison stammered, his voice rising in panic. Even if she inherited some property company today. It has absolutely nothing to do with us, Harrison continued frantically. We are here to sever ties. We are here to seize her venture capital firm for the damage she caused to our commercial leases. You still do not understand, do you, Harrison? I finally spoke, my voice cutting through the heavy tension in the room. I kept my posture relaxed, leaning back in my chair and looking directly at my stepfather. You still think my holding company acquiring your defaulted commercial leases was just a random aggressive business tactic? You think I was acting like a rogue investor today? Gregory adjusted his silver cuffs and pulled another document from his master folder. This one was aged, the paper slightly yellowed at the edges, but the heavy black ink of the property deed was unmistakably clear. Harrison, Gregory said, drawing the patriarch's attention back to the head of the table. When you and your father, before you built the Kensington retail empire, you did not actually purchase the premium land your flagship stores were built upon. You wanted to preserve your capital for inventory and marketing. So you entered into a long-term ground lease agreement for the properties now. That is standard corporate practice, Harrison snapped, though a thick sheen of sweat was beginning to form on his forehead. We lease the land, we build the structures. It is a mutually beneficial arrangement for both parties involved. Indeed, it is, Gregory agreed smoothly. And when Beatrice insisted on building that massive fortress-like ancestral estate in the suburbs to cement your status in the high society circles, you utilized the exact same financial strategy. You leased an enormous parcel of premium undeveloped land in the most exclusive zip code in the county. You built your mansion on dirt now that you did not actually own. Beatrice gasped sharply, her hands flying to her mouth. She looked at her husband with wide, terrified eyes. Harrison, what is he talking about? Of course we own our home. We built it from scratch. You own the bricks and the mortar. Beatrice Gregory clarified, his tone devoid of any sympathy. But you do not own the ground underneath it. You never have. Gregory slid the aged, yellowed document across the smooth mahogany surface. He placed it right next to the brightly colored DNA testing box that Bianca had brought with her today now. Tessa's biological father, Gregory stated, enunciating every single word with brutal clarity, was the man who originally purchased all of those specific parcels of land. He owned the commercial blocks downtown where your flagship luxury stores currently operate. And he owned the sprawling suburban acreage where you built your mansion. Harrison stared at the yellowed deed resting on the polished mahogany table. His eyes locked on the signature of the man he had spent 3 decades calling a worthless failure. His breath hitched painfully deep in his throat. He reached out with trembling fingers, pulling the aged document closer, as if examining the faded ink would somehow make the terrifying reality disappear. That is absolutely impossible, Harrison stammered, his voice cracking under the weight of his rising panic. We have operated those flagship retail stores for over 30 years. We built this massive estate from the ground up. We have established property rights in this city. You cannot just invalidate decades of corporate infrastructure with one piece of paper. There are automatic renewal clauses. There are commercial tenant protections built into these agreements. We have lawyers who will tie this up in court for the next 20 years. Gregory did not flinch at the sudden, desperate outburst. He simply steepled his fingers and looked at Harrison with the cold, clinical detachment of a man who held all the winning cards. You are entirely correct regarding standard procedure, Harrison Gregory said smoothly. A standard commercial ground lease does typically include robust provisions for renewal. In fact, the 30-year ground lease negotiated by Tessa's biological father was set to officially expire exactly 1 week ago, precisely on Tessa's 33rd birthday. Under normal circumstances, you would have been granted the option to renew the lease for another 30 years, ensuring the continued operation of your retail empire and the security of your suburban mansion. Beatrice let out a ragged, desperate gasp of relief, seizing onto the tiny sliver of hope Gregory had just carelessly dangled in front of them. Then we will simply renew it right now, my mother demanded, her voice shrill and echoing off the glass walls. We will sign whatever extension paperwork is required today. We will pay the renewal fees out of our personal accounts. You cannot just take our home away from us over a simple clerical oversight. I leaned forward in my leather chair, resting my forearms on the heavy mahogany table. You are not listening to him, Beatrice, I said, making sure my tone was completely devoid of any sympathy. You do not have the option to renew. Gregory nodded in agreement, pulling a final heavily stamped document from his master folder. He slid it across the table to sit directly beside the yellowed deed. A ground lease renewal is strictly contingent upon the tenant remaining in absolute good standing, Gregory explained, his voice filling the quiet conference room. The covenants of this specific generational trust are incredibly rigid. They require the tenant to maintain perfect financial solvency, to honor all commercial rent obligations on time, and to operate without any history of financial fraud or corporate malfeasance. Harrison went completely rigid. The last remaining drops of color vanished from his face as the crushing realization hit him. The commercial lease defaults, the aggressive collection protocols I had initiated just days earlier, the forensic audit proving he had embezzled from a minor. Because you have severely defaulted on your commercial leases across the city. Gregory continued, his words striking like physical blows, and because the forensic accounting report conclusively proves you engaged in massive financial fraud by embezzling from Tessa's custodial accounts, you are in catastrophic breach of the ground lease covenants. You have fundamentally violated the legal terms of your tenancy. Therefore, the ground lease cannot and will not be renewed under any circumstances. Bianca was shaking her head back and forth, her hands gripping the edge of the mahogany table so tightly her knuckles were turning stark white. But the buildings, she pleaded, her voice rising in a panicked, high-pitched whine. We paid for the buildings. My dad built the retail stores. We built the mansion. You cannot just steal the massive buildings we paid for. That is the brutal beauty of a commercial ground lease. Bianca, I said, looking directly into my sister's terrified, tear-filled eyes. When a ground lease expires without a legal renewal, every single physical structure built upon that land automatically and unconditionally reverts to the landowner. You do not own the ground, which means you no longer own anything that sits on top of it. Harrison let out a choked, devastated sound. He slumped back into his ergonomic leather chair, his chest heaving as he stared blindly at the ceiling of the law office. His entire life's work, the massive retail dynasty he had lorded over his entire family, was completely gone. The flagship stores that projected his immense wealth to the world were no longer his to control. He was a completely and utterly ruined man. My mother covered her mouth with both hands, thick tears streaming down her perfectly contoured face, ruining her expensive makeup. Her breathing became rapid and shallow as she looked around the pristine room, desperately searching for a way out of the waking nightmare. The sprawling ancestral estate she used to host high society galas, the mansion where she had so proudly banished me to the smallest bedroom, was officially my property. She was now effectively homeless and entirely destitute. Everything you have ever bragged about belongs to me. Now, I told them, my voice ringing with absolute unbreakable certainty. The corporate offices you run, the flagship boutiques you manage, the massive suburban estate you live in, all of it sits on dirt that my biological father bought decades ago. And because you could not manage to run a clean solvent business, you have legally forfeited every single brick back to me. I stood up from my chair, taking my time as I smoothed the fabric of my emerald green dress. I walked slowly around the massive oval table until I was standing directly behind the chairs where my mother and stepfather sat, completely paralyzed by their total financial ruin. I looked down at Bianca, who was sobbing openly now, the cruel, arrogant golden child finally breaking under the weight of real, inescapable consequences. She had lost her billionaire fiancé last night, and she had just lost her entire family fortune this morning. You do not own the retail business, I said, projecting my voice so it commanded every corner of the vast executive conference room. You do not own your sprawling suburban mansion. You do not own your luxury cars because they were purchased using corporate funds from a company you no longer control. In fact, Harrison, you do not even own the expensive leather chairs you are currently sitting on. I reached out and picked up the brightly colored cardboard DNA testing box from the center of the mahogany table. I turned it over in my hands, feeling the lightweight cardboard against my fingertips. I looked back down at my sister. You thought you were so incredibly clever at the country club, Bianca, I whispered, making sure she heard every single syllable loud and clear. You handed me this genetic test because you desperately wanted to publicly humiliate me. You wanted to prove that I was an outsider. You wanted to prove that I was a biological mistake who had absolutely no right to claim the precious Kensington legacy. I tossed the colorful box back onto the table. It landed with a soft thud right on top of the yellowed property deed. Your little joke of a birthday gift did not prove I was a mistake, I told my horrified family, watching their entire universe collapse into ash. It was the exact biological proof the state registry needed. It legally activated my absolute ownership of everything you claimed to be yours. You handed me the keys to your entire empire on a silver platter, and now I am locking you out of it forever. Harrison stared at the yellowed deed resting on the polished mahogany table, his eyes locked on the signature of the man he had spent 3 decades calling a worthless failure. He reached out with trembling fingers, pulling the aged document closer, as if examining the faded ink would somehow make the terrifying reality disappear. "That is absolutely impossible," Harrison stammered. "We have operated those flagship retail stores for over 30 years. We built this massive estate from the ground up. We have established irrefutable property rights in this city. You cannot just invalidate decades of corporate infrastructure with one piece of paper. There are automatic renewal clauses. There are commercial tenant protections built into these agreements." He continued, gasping for air. "You cannot simply strip away everything we have built. We have teams of elite corporate lawyers who will tie this up in court for the next 20 years. Gregory did not flinch. He simply steepled his fingers and looked at Harrison with the cold, clinical detachment of a man who held all the winning cards. "You are entirely correct regarding standard procedure," Harrison Gregory said smoothly. "A standard commercial ground lease does typically include robust provisions for renewal. In fact, the 30-year ground lease negotiated by Tessa's biological father was set to officially expire exactly 1 week ago, precisely on Tessa's 33rd birthday. Under normal circumstances, you would have been granted the legal option to renew the lease for another 30 years, ensuring the continued operation of your retail empire and the overall security of your sprawling suburban mansion and offices." Beatrice let out a ragged gasp of relief, seizing onto the tiny sliver of hope Gregory had just dangled in front of them. "Then we will simply renew it right now," my mother demanded, her voice shrill. "We will sign whatever extension paperwork is required today. We will pay the renewal fees immediately. You cannot just take our home away from us over a simple clerical oversight." I leaned forward in my leather chair. "You are not listening to him, Beatrice," I said, making sure my tone was completely devoid of any lingering sympathy. "You do not have the option to renew your lease today, tomorrow, or ever." Gregory nodded, pulling a final heavily stamped document from his master folder. He slid it across the table beside the yellowed deed. "A ground lease renewal is strictly contingent upon the tenant remaining in absolute good standing," Gregory explained. "The covenants of this generational trust are incredibly rigid. They require the tenant to maintain perfect financial solvency, honor all commercial rent obligations on time, and operate without any history of financial fraud." Harrison went completely rigid. The color vanished from his face as the crushing realization hit him. The commercial lease defaults, the aggressive collection protocols I had initiated just days earlier, the brutal forensic audit proving he had actively embezzled from a minor's trust fund to save his failing stock portfolio. "Because you have severely defaulted on your commercial leases across the city," Gregory continued, "and because the forensic accounting report conclusively proves you engaged in massive financial fraud by embezzling from Tessa's custodial accounts, you are in catastrophic breach of the ground lease covenants. You have fundamentally violated the legal terms of your tenancy. Therefore, the ground lease cannot be renewed." Bianca was shaking her head back and forth, her hands gripping the table edge so tightly, her knuckles were turning stark white. "But the buildings," she pleaded. "We paid for the buildings. My dad built the retail stores. We built the mansion. You cannot just steal the massive buildings we paid for with our own money." "That is the brutal beauty of a commercial ground lease," Bianca, I said. "When a ground lease expires without a legal renewal, every single physical structure built upon that land automatically and unconditionally reverts to the landowner. You do not own the ground, which means you no longer own anything that sits on top of it." Harrison let out a choked, devastated sound. He slumped back into his ergonomic leather chair, his chest heaving as he stared blindly at the ceiling of the law office. His entire life's work, the massive retail dynasty he had lorded over his family, was completely gone. The flagship stores that projected his immense wealth were no longer his to control. He was a completely ruined man. My mother covered her mouth with both hands, thick tears streaming down her perfectly contoured face. Her breathing became rapid and shallow as she looked around the pristine room, desperately searching for a way out of the waking nightmare. The sprawling ancestral estate she used to host high society galas, the mansion where she had banished me to the smallest bedroom, was officially my property. She was now effectively homeless and entirely destitute. Everything you have ever bragged about belongs to me now, I told them, my voice ringing with absolute unbreakable certainty. The corporate offices you run, the flagship boutiques you manage, the massive suburban estate you live in, all of it sits on dirt that my biological father bought decades ago. And because you could not manage to run a clean, solvent business, you have legally forfeited every single brick back to me. I stood up from my chair, taking my time as I smoothed the soft fabric of my emerald green dress. I walked slowly around the massive oval table until I was standing directly behind the chairs where my mother and stepfather sat, completely paralyzed by their total financial ruin. I looked down at Bianca, who was sobbing openly now, the cruel, arrogant golden child finally breaking under the tremendous weight of real, inescapable consequences. She had lost her billionaire fiancé last night, and she had just lost her entire family fortune this morning. "You do not own the retail business," I said, projecting my voice so it commanded every corner of the vast executive conference room. "You do not own your sprawling suburban mansion. You do not own your luxury cars because they were purchased using corporate funds from a company you no longer control. In fact, Harrison, you do not even own the expensive leather chairs you are currently sitting on." I reached out and picked up the brightly colored cardboard DNA testing box from the center of the mahogany table. I turned it over in my hands, feeling the lightweight cardboard against my fingertips. I looked back down at my sister, whose tears were falling onto the polished mahogany. "You thought you were so incredibly clever at the country club, Bianca," I whispered, making sure she heard every single syllable loud and clear. "You handed me this genetic test because you desperately wanted to publicly humiliate me. You wanted to prove that I was an outsider. You wanted to prove that I was nothing but a burden. You wanted to prove that I was a biological mistake who had absolutely no right to claim the precious Kensington legacy." I tossed the colorful box back onto the table. It landed with a soft thud right on top of the yellowed property deed, a perfect symbol of their own profound stupidity. "Your little joke of a birthday gift did not prove I was a mistake," I told my horrified family, watching their entire universe collapse into ash right before my eyes. "It was the exact biological proof the state registry needed. It legally activated my absolute ownership of everything you claim to be yours. You handed me the keys to your entire empire on a silver platter, and now I am locking you out of it forever." I did not wait to watch the final tears fall or listen to their pathetic apologies. I had seen enough. I reached across the table, picked up the cheap cardboard DNA box that had started this entire chain of events, and slipped it quietly into my leather portfolio. I turned my back on my mother, my stepfather, and my sister, leaving them to drown in the shallow, empty world they had created for themselves. I walked out of the executive conference room, my footsteps echoing down the long marble hallway. I pushed through the heavy glass doors of the law firm and stepped out onto the bustling city sidewalk. The crisp morning air filled my lungs, and for the first time in 33 years, every single breath felt entirely my own. I did not feel the need to gloat. I did not feel the urge to call the local newspapers or parade my victory around the country club. My victory was absolute, and their total silence was the only reward I truly needed. 6 months passed, and the Kensington name faded from the city with a pathetic whimper. I never spoke to them again. I did not answer the desperate letters my mother sent from her tiny, cramped apartment, nor did I entertain the pathetic business proposals Harrison tried to pass through my legal team before his federal trial began. I severed the ties, completely cutting the rotting branches off my family tree so I could finally grow. Instead of selling the sprawling suburban estate, I decided to repurpose it. I moved into the massive stone mansion and immediately went to work stripping away every single ounce of my mother's gaudy, pretentious influence. I donated the antique furniture, tore down the oppressive heavy drapes, and opened up the massive windows to let the natural light flood into the dark, cavernous rooms. The estate was no longer a fortress designed to intimidate outsiders and trap frightened children inside. I transformed the entire first floor into the central headquarters for my newly expanded philanthropic ventures. We turned the formal dining room where I had endured so many years of casual cruelty and sharp insults into a collaborative workspace for a foundation dedicated to funding female entrepreneurs who lacked access to traditional generational wealth. The house was no longer painfully quiet. It was constantly filled with the vibrant, buzzing energy of passionate people working toward actual, meaningful goals. I surrounded myself with a fiercely loyal circle of brilliant friends and dedicated colleagues. They did not care about my last name. They did not care about the old money social circles or the shallow prestige of country club memberships. They respected me for my sharp mind, my tireless work ethic, and the integrity I brought to every single business meeting. I had finally built the family I always deserved, a family bound together by mutual respect and genuine affection rather than toxic obligation and endless financial manipulation. Early one Tuesday morning, before the rest of my staff arrived for the day, I walked into my new home office. The room used to belong to Harrison, but I had completely gutted it. I replaced his massive, imposing mahogany desk with a sleek glass table and filled the surrounding bookshelves with vibrant plants and modern art. I poured myself a cup of dark, rich coffee and walked over to the expansive French doors. I pushed them open and stepped out onto the private stone balcony that overlooked the rolling green hills of the estate. The sun was just beginning to rise over the distant tree line, casting a brilliant array of warm gold and soft pink light across the morning sky. The air was cool and incredibly still. I stood there for a long time, holding the warm ceramic mug in my hands, listening to the gentle rustling of the wind through the ancient oak trees. I thought about the frightened, insecure girl who used to walk up the driveway of this exact property with her head hung low, terrified of making a single mistake. I wished I could reach back through time and tell her that she was never the problem. I wished I could tell her that she was entirely capable of building her own empire from scratch. I turned around and walked back into my office. Sitting right in the center of my sleek glass desk was the brightly colored DNA testing box. I had kept it around for the last 6 months as a quiet reminder of the exact moment my life changed forever. Bianca had purchased it for $20 at a local pharmacy, hoping to use it as a weapon to destroy my self-esteem and cast me out of her elite society. She thought it would prove that I was nothing but a worthless mistake. I slowly picked up the small cardboard box from the glass desk. I looked at the sterile barcode printed on the side. It held absolutely no power over my future anymore. It was just a useless piece of cheap cardboard. I did not need a genetic test to tell me where I belonged. I already knew my own true worth, and I had the entire life I built to prove it. I tossed the box directly into the metal trash can beside my desk. It landed with a very soft final thud. I slowly walked back out onto the stone balcony and took a long, satisfying sip of my coffee. I watched the bright golden sunlight spill across the vast, beautiful property that I owned completely and unconditionally. There was no anger left in my heart. There was no lingering bitterness or any desire for further revenge. The toxic weight that had anchored me down for over 3 decades was entirely gone, replaced by a profound, breathtaking lightness. I smiled at the rising sun, feeling the warm morning rays wash over my face. The ultimate sweet revenge was my own absolute unbreakable peace. The hardest lesson I had to learn was that sharing blood with someone does not automatically make them family. For 33 years, I allowed my mother, my stepfather, and my sister to define my worth. I believed that if I just worked a little harder or stayed a little quieter, they would finally accept me. But toxic people do not want you to succeed. They want you to remain small so they can feel big. If you are watching this and you are trapped in a similar cycle of family abuse, I want you to hear this loud and clear. Your value is not determined by the people who refuse to see it. You do not owe your loyalty to anyone who treats your very existence as an inconvenience or a punchline. You have the absolute right to walk away from tables where respect is no longer being served. My revenge was not about ruining my family. It was about reclaiming the power they stole from me and protecting the future I built with my own 2 hands. The greatest victory you can ever achieve against those who try to destroy you is simply living a beautiful, successful, and peaceful life entirely without them. You are capable of building your own empire, surrounding yourself with people who actually celebrate your light, instead of trying to extinguish it. Have you ever had to cut ties with a toxic family member to protect your own peace? How did you find the courage to finally walk away? Please share your story in the comments section below. If my journey resonated with you today, hit that like button and subscribe to the channel for more stories about resilience and reclaiming your power. Thank you for listening, and remember to always know your worth.